Finding God, finding Janet in all things. How did Janet find God in all things? Or perhaps more importantly, how did God find her? Now, you may be relieved to know that I made an early executive decision not to talk about all things, because eternity wouldn't be quite enough time. So I'm going to focus on three things, and they're connected. I have some reflections on the impact on Janet's spirituality of her relationship to the natural world. I want to follow a little hobby horse of mine with some reflections on her family context, particularly looking at the evangelical brand of Anglicanism in which she grew up. I only have something short to say about it. I think it's worthy of more research. I'm particularly interested in the influence of Theodosia, her eldest half-sister. And that will lead me into a few thoughts on the impact of bereavement and of mourning on Janet's spiritual life. And I would be very interested to hear other people's thoughts on that, particularly anybody who has done some training in bereavement counselling or anything to do with the impact that death and bereavement has on people as they grow up. Books were a very important influence on Janet Stewart, as anybody who's read Maud Monaghan's biography knows, but I've left that for another year. There's too much to say. So, firstly, thinking about her relationship with the natural world. Maud Monaghan quotes Janet Stewart as saying that her first call came to her through the mountains. There aren't any mountains actually in Rutland, but never mind. Through the mountains, mist and the ocean. Through the natural world. There are 2 points to be made about her relationship with the natural world, I think. First, it was in this context that she developed her powers of observation and of reflection on what she observed. She was a great bird watcher. This is why I like Janet Stewart. She really did know her ornithology. And these observation powers were ones that she put to very good use later on in her educational work, both in her observation of children in school and of her community members. I'm sure that was a little bit, sometimes one felt a little bit observed, I think, with Janet, but still. Also in the way she tried to encourage the teachers among her community to train their own powers of observation so as to educate more effectively. And there's a whole paper to be written one day on the influence of the German polymath Goethe on Janet's education philosophy. And indeed, I think her essay on colour is influenced somewhere by his philosophy of colour. So, her powers of observation. But more importantly, a second point, which flows from that first one, is the development of a contemplative attitude to the world in her heart and her mind, as she absorbed the sights and sounds of the natural world that was all around her as a child. I sought God everywhere in his creatures, she wrote. He seemed to me to be the heart of creation, drawing all things to himself. And this idea gave me my first living knowledge of him. She was allowed to go wandering miles from home, according to Maud Monaghan. And in her own words, she strayed like a vagabond among God's creatures. She was aware of the dark side of nature, and there's a lovely comment in a letter she wrote towards the end of her life to somebody who'd sent her a clipping from the Times newspaper about magpies. I've had a little run-in with magpies recently. Magpies predate the eggs, particularly of game birds, all right, so like pheasants and things like that. And of course Janet is interested in hunting, shooting and fishing and such things. So she writes to the person who sent her this clipping, "There is no excuse for the magpies. Yet they too are God's creatures, God's own magpies. What a problem." There's a little touch of, Janet's awareness of the problem of evil, so-called there. Yet she believed profoundly in the essential goodness of creation. And she wrote to somebody, "It is not the wicked world that is best worth giving." She put wicked in inverted commas there. "But the good and glorious world, solitude and deep woods and great silences, and one may add, hunting." She had studied the poet Wordsworth, inevitably in the schoolroom, but also in the course she had started in about 1892-3 as an external student at London University. She didn't finish the course because she was made the vicar of the English Vicariate. And her adult attitudes to nature were coloured by Wordsworth's poetry. For example, in a conference at Roehampton in 1902, she quoted from Wordsworth's poem Broome Castle. And the bit she quotes is very typical Wordsworth. His daily teachers, or we can say her daily teachers, had been woods and rills, the silence that is in the starry sky, the sleep that is among the lonely hills. Listen, ponder, hold them dear, for of God they are. And in this conference of 1902, her main point was about education. And she was saying, quite rightly, that education is more than examinations, and a good educator is more than an instrument of government quality assurance. It's a lesson that we do well to remind ourselves and our governments today. In order to be a good educator, in Janet's view, one needed to have acquired from nature a hearing ear, a seeing eye, the large horizon of solitude and quiet of mind. In other words, a contemplative attitude that would enable one to learn from the other important teachers of life. So she wasn't saying it's just about sitting in forests. Oh, I like sitting in forests, but it's not just about sitting in forests listening to silence. The other teachers are relationships with others, differences with others, responsibility, and what she called the gifts of cities and their burden. But in order to be able to relate contemplatively to those, in her view, it was an advantage to have learned from the teacher that is nature. She loved unknown and unexpected paths, writes Maud Monaghan, quoting a passage from Janet's essay, Highways and Byways in the Spiritual Life, which was given in 1909. Byways whose terminus is often nothing at all, where the mysteries call us onward and the shy nightingales sing, and the stress of life is lifted off, and the ticking of time is still, where life seems larger because of silence and calm, where the soul may be invaded and taken captive, unresisting by the powers of the world to come. Later on, exploring the implications of her growing sense of vocation with Peter Galway, SJ, it was this aspect of what she would have to give up that seems to have been hardest to get over for Janet. She records that during her first retreat, before asking to enter, she sat on the terrace at Roehampton and wondered if she would be able to exchange the freedom to explore countryside and other countries — she was quite a traveller even then — for a life confined within 33 acres of land. It was what cost me the most, she remembered. The letters she preserves from Peter Galway, and of course there were many more, but these are the ones that were not destroyed, which is interesting. And the letters that she has preserved focus on this struggle. Galway applauds her love of nature and beauty. He tries to explain to her, in his letters to her, the principle and foundation. In his language, that was the call, an old-fashioned, the call to use the creature to discover the creator. So that nature is loved not for its own sake, but to reach through it to the God that she sought in the natural world. He encouraged her in the contemplative art of fishing, because he said it would give her mind enough to do, but let her heart, her spirit, commune with the Almighty. And he invited her to pray the I always say this wrong, Benedicite, while she was walking or when she was taken with a view. And she was perhaps thinking of Peter Galway when she concluded her 1902 conference with a quote not from Wordsworth, but from the Benedicite. So she begins her conclusion in her own words. Let the woods, the rills, the starry skies influence and then steal over each power of our soul and every mood of our mind, so that they, teachers sent from God, may make a sanctuary silence within us, vibrating to every touch of their Creator and the works of his hands. O all ye works of the Lord, bless the Lord, praise and exalt him forever. Her sense of creatureliness and her search for her Creator were also bound up, as they are for all of us, with her family. And she said later that she learned to admire and adore as the 13th child who has many opportunities for looking up. And you can read in Monaghan about her childhood days, her close relationship with her father, rather nice, grandfatherly looking figure there, much older than, of course, when she was growing up. Her interest in farming matters, which is evident in her essay Thoughts of 1903, which is worth reading, where she draws on her knowledge of farmers' corn markets, horses and hunting. And there isn't time tomorrow, but one day, when you've nothing better to do and you're in the Rutland area, go to Oakham, where there's a wonderful little corn market, and it was the county town for Cottesmore, and she would have gone there very, very frequently, I'm quite sure. She also talks of two key moments, as she remembers them later on, of failing to persuade God to resurrect her mother, and her response to her brother's challenge to identify her telos. Do you remember those stories? Yes? The strands I want to pick out briefly here are the evangelical background and influence of her sister Theodosia, who brought her up from the age of 2. There's a lovely photo of Theodosia. There are some others much later when she was very ill with TB. But this is the nicest one. Can you see it? Yeah? And the sense of bereavement and mourning that framed the search for her telos. Firstly, the particular brand of Anglicanism that formed Janet's spiritual background. This was middle of the road rather than Puritan, but it was earnest and moral. One of the sort of marginal figures in Janet's family, I don't know that she would ever have met him, was her great-uncle, the Earl of Gainsborough. I showed you a photo of him yesterday on that biographical PowerPoint. He had been in the Navy at some point, and he'd gone to the island of Elba where Napoleon was incarcerated, and he left evangelical tracts for Napoleon to read in the hope that he would convert him to true Christianity. And his 4th wife, who was some step-aunt of Janet's, was lady-in-waiting to Queen Victoria, and apparently was unafraid of chiding, of telling the Queen off for going to the races and travelling on the Sabbath. So these people are around, you know, on creating the culture of Janet's family, and I think some of those attitudes are ones that she inherits and transforms in her own context. We get a flavour of this spirituality from the sermons her father preached Sunday by Sunday, and from the correspondence between Theodosia and Theodosia's second cousin, Victoria Noel Buxton. Victoria is the daughter of the Queen Victoria chiding mother, okay? There she is. And she's not important for our story, except she was a philanthropist, and there is a link between her and the other group that's here, the Mothers' Union. Because Victoria was one of the foundresses, I believe, of the Mothers' Union. She was a philanthropist in her own right. And there's a sequence of letters between her and Theodosia. They were best buddies. Victoria was a confidant of Theodosia's, and what these letters reveal is a spirituality that is intensely personal in its focus on a loving God present in Christ, forgiving and redeeming the world through the sacrifice of the cross. And all this is coming across in her father's sermons as well. Life for Canon Stewart is a school where individuals are tried through suffering and after death rewarded for their faith in heaven. According to him, studying the New Testament is the best protection from spiritual vagueness. And vagueness is a pet hate of Janet's. She's constantly encouraging her community, making them sit up straighter and not be vague, spiritually, intellectually, and physically. The emphasis is on ongoing conversion and the call to respond to God's love by living out one's moral duty in every detail of life, and living the mission of caring for others in faith and love on a day-to-day basis. If anybody has read Middlemarch by George Eliot, which Janet Stewart hated, and this is where she and I must part ways because it's my favourite novel of all time, but Dorothea Brooke in that novel is a good kind of literary type that I think Theodosia was very like Dorothea. And it's interesting, in view of Janet's own later close identification with the saint, that one of Canon Stewart's sermons focuses on Mary Magdalene, who of course was yesterday's feast day. Nice synchronicity. And he focuses on Mary Magdalene as a model of the call to a close personal intimacy with Christ, which he believed, and so did Janet, can be emulated by each one, particularly in their service of others. Theodosia herself seems to have had a lively sense of friendship with Jesus. There's a wonderful story, as she tells her friend Victoria, of how she falls off her horse, throws her when she's out riding, and she jumps up, shaken but not stirred, as it were, and has this sense of God's loving presence with her, or specifically of Christ's presence with her. And she wrote to Vicky, I'll just read you this little bit, that Christ seemed to be teasing her and saying, "So you see, I do look after you." And she continues to her friend, "I can't tell you how delicious it was, such an intense feeling of Christ's ever-present watchfulness. No presence, I just can't express it, as if he meant me to hear, 'Why do you ever doubt my watchful presence with you?' Now, Vicky, don't think me very irreverent for speaking like this, only I can't tell you what I felt in a more reverent way." I think that's charming, don't you? Oh, lovely. Theodosia delighted in her role as adoptive mother to her 4 young half-siblings and as a Sunday school teacher for the village children. And she saw all of this as work given to her directly by God, a way to live out her desire to respond to his love by being of use. Janet may well have rebelled against the faith of her father and of her sister, in the sense that she was sensitive and reserved and shy of demonstrative expressions of emotion in faith. And of course, her trust in God's providence had been piqued badly at the failure of her experiment at her mother's grave, where indeed she had prayed with all her heart, but in vain. She was not one either, she was such an independent, strong-minded person, but she was not one to take her own faith ready-made from others. Nevertheless, once she did find her own faith, it is striking how very similar it is in its affective grasp of what she described in 1899 in very evangelical terms as a personal service to a personal master. The importance of doing one's duty cheerfully, however distasteful it might be, and her consistent emphasis on the tender love of the heart of Jesus and of the human pilgrimage to a better land. Remember the lines in Spirit Seeking, lead us through the land of shadows to thy blessed eternity. It seems to have been a happy family, though Janet was later to complain of a rather ceremonious upbringing, perhaps with an often absent father, an anxious 19-year-old sister as substitute mother, and frequently changing nurses and governesses. And it may be worth dwelling a little bit more on the fact of death and bereavement in her family experience. There was nothing unusual in the context of the period. Or almost, yes, I think all, bar one, of Janet's great aunts-in-law, step-aunts, whatever, died in childbirth. So that, I mean, they weren't directly her family, but that's what happened in the period. However, in Janet's more immediate family, there was a lot of death, and a significant number of deaths took place in the year of her birth. And one of them in particular affected Theodosia very profoundly. Theodosia had lost her own mother in 1845 when she herself was only 6, the same age that Janet was trying to get her mother to come out of the grave. And Theodosia's younger sister, just 1 year younger than she, died, also aged 6, just a year later. Her father, Canon Stewart, remarried when she, Theodosia, was 10, and her new stepmama was only 19. That's Janet's mother. By 1856, 2 children of Janet's mother, Theodosia's stepmother, had died in infancy. In August of 1857, a 3rd child of Penelope Stewart, 4-year-old Helen, died, just a few months before Janet's birth. And in May of that year, the same year, Theodosia's eldest full brother, Robert, died, aged 21. I don't know what of. He was in France at the time, and there's a whole set of letters about the family rushing over to be with him as he died. Theodosia doesn't mention the other deaths in her extant letters, but Robert's death seems to devastate her. "I loved him better than God," she wrote to Vicky. "I cared to please him more than God." And tragically, she believes it is for this reason that God has taken him. "Oh, if you knew how cold and dead my heart is, it feels as if it could not love," she writes at about the same time. Taking over the upbringing of her stepmother's family in 1859, after Penelope herself had died, Theodosia, therefore, was having to cope with plenty of bereavement, and perhaps, most unconsciously, the bereavement of the loss of her own future. So on the one hand, she was delighted to have a role, to be useful, but on the other hand, by being stepmother to her 4 children, she was almost certainly never going to have a husband of her own. And it is not just speculation to believe that in some way all this might have played out, even if unconsciously, in the apparent Arcadia of Janet's early life. As Maud Monaghan points out, Janet lost Theodosia twice. In the early 1870s, when Theodosia became seriously ill with TB and withdrew from active management of the house and family, and in 1878, when her sister finally died, aged 39, in Bournemouth. Alone of her brothers and sisters, Janet refused to pay her respects to Theodosia's body, as was the custom at the time. And that may suggest something of her anger and her grief, and her fear. She admitted later on to being afraid of death. Throughout her life, she was to refer mournfully to a sense of loss and loneliness, of not being understood by anyone as a mother might understand her, of her incompleteness without a mother. This weighed on her sufficiently for her to raise it with her spiritual director, Alban Goodyear, in 1909. To whom she complained that not having known her own mother, she was less able to relate closely or simply with Mary, with Our Lady, or, she later states, to God himself. She said, I'm always shy with God. She treats Mary as queen rather than as mother, she says, although in 1909 she's hopeful that she might be beginning to develop a new relationship with Mary. Now, the mother she never had in her mind was, of course, an idealised product of wishful thinking and Victorian sentimentality about the angel in the house, and may have contributed to the emotional and spiritual energy she was later to invest in fostering a sense of family in her communities, of spiritual mothers and daughters and sons, as she called them. And her final conference to the Roehampton community in 1914 focuses on the community as a family, and how all the communities in the society have different family characteristics, different kind of ethos, and how each RSCJ is the daughter of the house, or should aspire to be, and as such is in receipt of God's higher education. So even if she didn't want to send them all to secular universities, she thought that spiritual training everybody received in the society was a kind of spiritual higher education. The experience of bereavement, mourning and loneliness, direct and indirect, became a factor in her spirituality in other ways too. The soul of our vocation, she told the community at Timaru in New Zealand in January 1914, is to grieve with and to comfort Christ. And she uses this particular image, to comfort Christ as a motherless child who feels so alone because there is no one who understands or cares. This is what Christ, and at the end of her conference she even says God, is like. And the vocation of an RSCJ is to be that mother to him. Whatever one makes of that, God in Christ as a motherless child and the praying human being as his mother is a remarkable thought. It was Theodosia, a relative later said, who kept the family together, and at her death there were closer links between the Cottesmore Stuarts and the Catholic branch of Janet's mother's family, now in possession of the family seat at Exton. I think Canon Stuart was an absent father in many ways, because during the year of mourning, which in Victorian days in England was taken very seriously, Beatrice and Janet were able to accept an invitation to a gathering of the Catholic family at Exton. And this was at a time when Canon Stuart would have known that his son Horace was himself interested in Catholicism. So there's a loss of control in the family. And it was a result of this new contact that Janet met the Catholic branch of her family and read a book led by one of her cousins to her brother Horace. Another cousin taught Janet the Memorare, in which she was able to assert that it is impossible for anyone to approach Our Lady and for her to let them down. And it was Aideen Kinland who pointed out to me when I was doing a version of this in Dublin a little while ago, that Janet had been let down by God, aged 6, but aged, what was she now, about 20, she found Mary and was able somehow to believe that Mary wouldn't let her down. And this was, she said, her first proper prayer as a grown-up. And she clung to it, and she used that word, I clung, as the first definite something to appear through what she called the darkness of her agnostic teenage years. Her Catholic friend, Harriet Ross, introduced Janet to Father Peter Galway, I've mentioned him, at Farm Street, and Janet began to visit him and correspond with him as her spiritual director. And she was received into the Catholic Church at the Altar of the Sacred Heart in Farm Street on the 6th of March, 1879. Remarkably, in my view, only just over a year after Theodosia's death. Very short space of time. I started with the question, how did she find God in all things? Or rather, how did he find her in a range of her experience? If she prayed, wordlessly, in some form or other, give me only your love and your grace, how was it answered? Through nature, yes. In books, eventually. In her family relationships. And, I think, in the absences, the deaths, the unspoken griefs, and in an atmosphere where the conscious practice of an ardent, effective and dutiful faith provided her with a God to be rebelled against and a God to discover. He found her, that is, in everything, in life. That's that. Now,